Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Welcome wherever you are to this first webinar of 2019 from the Mindfulness Center of Excellence. And we are here to talk about a very interesting topic, very relevant topic for today's times. And we've got an awesome guest who's going to be dialoguing today on the topic of sex and gender. So this is part of a series of webinars where the Mindfulness Center, the virtual Mindfulness Center of Excellence, is aiming to push the boundaries, to go to topics that other people are maybe trying to just tread a little bit cautiously around, but really with the intention of gaining a deeper understanding, having the difficult conversations, but using what we know about the brain, what we know from mindfulness and from compassion work to really help us tackle some of the challenging questions. We're going to be talking about sex, and so I hope that title got your attention. And certainly sex is on the brain for most of us quite a lot of the time. And I love this little GIF here. It really, really makes me laugh. I saw it a few years ago and managed to find it again. It's a little bit rude, so if you've got any kids watching the webinar, avert their eyes, or actually not, let them look. Come on, let's be real about what happens, the bodies, the sweatiness, the fluids, yeah, all of this stuff. Yeah, sex is not bad, sex is not wrong, but just how we're kind of being positioned with it, is something that needs us to take another look, a closer look and a mindful look. And we're going to be talking a little bit about sex and gender as well. And so our expert today is Meg John Barker, whose career really has, I'll let MJ explain some of the work that's been conducted around gender, sexuality, but also through this lens of mindfulness and compassion. And you could maybe even have as a reflection for yourself, when did you last think about gender? When did you last give yourself the opportunity to reflect on how your brain and mind has been shaped by your environment, by your culture, around the topic of gender and sex? Now, MJ's got lots of resources that you can tap into on various Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Rewritingtherules.com is a book that I believe is getting re-edited. So you can see lots of information, lots of resources here. But now let me turn to MJ and just ask they to introduce themselves. And then maybe we'll do a little pause before we kind of get more into the discussion. So a warm welcome. Please introduce yourself.
Thanks so much. It's really good to be here. It's two topics I'm so passionate about. So I've written on both mindfulness and on gender and sex. So to bring them together is a rare opportunity, actually. Usually you get asked to talk about the one or the other. I'm mostly a self-help author these days. So I write on sex, gender and relationships for a general audience, both books and zines and podcasts as well. But also I have a background in psychotherapy and mindfulness and a background in academia. So I've studied sex, gender and relationships academically for a couple of decades, and I've also practiced as a therapist in those areas. So kind of bringing all that together in order to hopefully write stuff that's useful for people in terms of figuring this stuff out for themselves, because we all have a relationship to sex and a relationship to gender. And I guess that's one of the things I'm really passionate about, is making this an everyone conversation rather than just a minority conversation, because I don't believe really it is a minority who are influenced by gender stuff.
Yeah. And I think that's great. What I really love about your work is that mixing and the blending of the multiple disciplines, the multiple lenses, the different kind of angles that you can kind of come to that work. And I think this helps us really speak to that core humanity piece. So you're kind of like a walking multidisciplinary team, which is great. Like how do we bring that together and help people?
Yeah.
And, I guess one of the ways that we can maybe start this conversation is let's use what we know about mindfulness and the principles of mindfulness to help enter into that conversation. So even for myself, noticing a very strong need to be mindful of language when I refer to you. Mm-hmm. And this is one of the things that sometimes people struggle with is how do I address this individual, this person? If it's not a he or a she, which comes so automatically to our mind and to our lips, how can we be skillful with that? And certainly I believe that mindfulness and how it trains your brain, these inhibitory networks, this kind of pulling back region of the right ventrolateral prefrontal cortex is what helps me to not come with the prepotent response, which is her or him, and instead do something different with my mind and brain. And it's effortful. It is effortful because we're changing networks.
And it's like the attention piece of mindfulness to notice that moment and do something different, and also the compassion piece of mindfulness to get that's important and to want to do it for ethical reasons.
So what I find helpful is something called the transitional pause. So this allows me, to calm down a bit, because of course it's the excitement of being online and doing the webinar, but also really get the brain tuned into those intentions. So those that are watching as well, you're invited to just pause. Let's do a small, maybe 3-minute practice, transitional pause. And you can close your eyes if you wish to. And you don't need to make a big deal of it, but really maybe tuning into the body and just checking that the body feels comfortable initially. And then taking 3 breaths to begin. And as you take those 3 breaths, beginning to notice what you bring with you into this call, into this webinar from the day thus far. Just really acknowledging and opening to the footprint that the day, the conversations, the activities has left on the mind-body system. Really allowing yourself to feel and experience how the day, conversations, and tasks have left their mark. And then let's go deeper. Let's see if we can, just for a few moments, get a glimpse of what we bring with us into this call in terms of our conditioning around sex and gender. Even noticing what words or phrases or images come up when you hear those words. Sex, gender. Really taking an honest look at what's there for us around these topics. Just a glimpse for now. What is the footprint of our experiences and conversations, our training and education, perhaps even our faith practice, spirituality, around this topic? And having given that a little bit of a glimpse, a little bit of air, some space, some kindness and interest, let's come to the here and now. Breathing in, breathing out, and feeling the contact of the body against the chair, or wherever you're sitting or standing. Maybe the movement of the breath in the body. And if you need to, perhaps a shoulder roll or to the head tip, really tuning in to a mindful movement, but keeping the awareness here and now. Now, rolling the shoulders. Now, breathing in, breathing in. breathing out, breathing out. Feeling that contact of the body, effects of gravity, contact, pressure, temperature. And having opened and then narrowed the attention, coming into here and now. Now let's set our intentions for how we will approach this call, this topic. And if you wish to, if it's comfortable, placing a hand on the heart. If you wish to really tune in around compassionate intentions, compassion to understand the experience of others, compassion to ourselves as we maybe get things wrong or right in the moment of learning and change. And maybe really tuning in for yourself. Why are you here for this conversation? What brought you to this video, this webinar? Getting some sense of that can be helpful. The bigger picture why, particularly helpful if you are likely to be challenged. Supporting your brain and mind to stay in when things get difficult with a bigger intention. And if you're not sure, then suggesting using one of the 3 C's to set the mind, to select a mindset. And the first C is curiosity. How can we be really curious about the experience of people who maybe think or act or seem different to us? Bringing this child-eye view, openness, non-judgment, interest, really deep curiosity, a willingness to learn and grow. Perhaps some courage is needed. Courage to hear things that maybe our mind and brain is uncertain about, fearful of even. Intending courage. And then the really secret ingredient, compassion. Setting mind, brain, and heart to that dial that says deep compassion for self and others. Knowing that those two are related. And if one of those resonates more with you, really try to hold that in mind as we go into this conversation. Finishing with 3 breaths. Opening the eyes. So using some mindfulness processes there to help set up the conditions for the more challenging conversations. And we're talking about paradigm shift here, really. We're talking about really thinking and behaving differently in relation to sex and gender. So, MJ,
Yes,
tell us more about your experiences, your work.
I will do. I'm just noticing that when you mentioned curiosity, the dog that I live with got very curious about what is going on in my room. I hope that wasn't too distracting for people. I might just wedge my door slightly more shut so that she can't get in and disrupt us.
Yes, the perils of home working is pet.
Right?
I have that too.
I'm sure everyone would love to see Peanut, but it's not quite why we're here.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess um, I've been passionate about this area for so long. Oh, there's so many things you were saying, even just in the introduction, that I'm interested to jump off. But I guess I'm super interested about how the cultural norms of gender affect us all, really. And that's something I've been writing about for many years and feeling so impacted by myself. And as I say, I think the conversation that we need to be having is about how it affects everybody adversely. And it saddens me deeply that we're in the midst of this sort of moral panic around transgender at the moment, which makes it a conversation which is, you know, really just about one group of people, and is generally a kind of a debate about their very existence, when actually I think the conversations that should be happening about gender are much wider and about the effect on all of us and about how we're all united really by the effect that it has on us, even when that effect is different for different people.
Yes, and I think my sense is, as in many of these debates, there's this generational split, and it is the younger people that are provoking us in many ways, great ways, to start to think differently. But that is a challenge for those minds and brains that are a little bit more set.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wanted to read something. One of the books I was using to prepare for today's webinar is this great book here. I'll take a photo and share, but there was a beautiful line in it, which I wanted to read. So it says, it's not just trans people who would benefit if society were to become more flexible and open to the idea of multiple genders. A shift of this kind would be of benefit to all people.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe you can comment.
Absolutely. And I think it's even not just about gender. I found myself that as I try and pull this thread of gender and understand it better, I find out more and more how intrinsically linked it is to everything else, to race, class, disability. You can't really separate all of these. It's really about the history of how humans have come to treat each other in these kind of us and them ways, whereby we value some lives and bodies and some labor more than others. Like, that's what's at stake here. And that we have to all kind of recognize how we've been caught up in that, after millennia of this kind of approach. And so it's really deeply threatening, I think, because we have to face the ways both in which that kind of system has disadvantaged us and the ways that we have less in our lives because of it, and we also have to face the ways in which it has advantaged us, and we're all inevitably both. We're all inevitably kind of on the oppressor side and the marginalized side with this stuff. So I think it's a much bigger, every time I train on this issue, I think we get to this point where it's actually about a lot more than gender, and we're all implicated in it. So that's why I get quite frustrated with the sort of minority approach, where it's like, okay, let's find out how to be nice to transgender people. No, it's not about that. It's about all of us recognizing our complex relationship with gender and how that's part of these much wider cultural systems.
Absolutely. And I mean, I've been, getting obsessed with this as well, around the kind of using the language of paradigm shift, but it's the same problem everywhere, so that's whether you're talking about, the us and them in terms of the doctor and the patient, particularly pronounced in the psychiatric services, but also coming to the fore in mainstream health. Mm-hmm. Whether you're talking about, men and women, I'm looking at diversity, gender diversity on boards.
Yes.
It's the same problem, and kind of coming at it from the neuroscience point of view, it's how do we open the conversation in a way that doesn't get wrapped up too much in blame and shame.
Exactly. And that's the danger. And it's this, again, this real complex non-binary thing we're asking ourselves to do, which is actually hold this acknowledgement that our whole lives that we've been invested in these systems that have hurt other people or other animals often,
at the same time as, you know, like not falling into blame and shame so that we're just kind of frozen by that knowledge, but that we start to think creatively about what we can, and compassionately about what we can do differently, how to address that in ourselves and how to address that in our groups and our communities. It's a big ask, but it's the same ask that's being asked by trans people, by people of color, by disabled people, by the Me Too movement. You know, this is all this kind of cultural shaking stuff is getting at the same thing, I think. So yeah, just trying to tease off the gender piece and address that is kind of missing the point, I think.
And I guess I took some time to reflect on gender and I guess my own cultural conditioning around that, and you know, coming through, let's say, mainstream education, academia.
Yeah.
You know, this certainly has been, you know, quite a sort of male dominated environment. And, you know, I do get feedback from people that I'm quite, you know, I call it quite yang in my style, you know, quite loud, quite big, quite strong, the sort of male characteristics. You know, some of that's also my own personal journey about balancing my own yin and yang. And, you know, for me, I'm trying to look at this through multiple lenses. There's the kind of environments I grew up in, the modeling from the parents, what you understood from the parental relationships. You know, we would be looking at that in therapy. The environments where I spend a lot of time that kind of started shaping ideas, and, you know, even ideas like, well, if you want to be a successful academic, you can't have kids. You know, these sorts of things. And then I can also draw a little bit on my martial arts kind of Eastern traditions, which has been extremely helpful. And, you know, this idea that we all have a yin and yang inside us, and some could be a female but have more yang, some could be a male and have more yin, and the idea is to get balance, not the duality. Anything
and the Western approach, you know, and largely because of the certain kind of capitalism that came in after the war, it's quite a recent thing to see the genders as opposite in the way that we do the man and woman as opposite. And a lot of that's about, at a certain point in time, it was necessary that women laboured in the home and weren't paid for it, and that men laboured outside the home and were, and women were kind of reproducing the workforce and looking after the current workforce, and that was like the model. So it makes a lot of sense to say, oh well, then that means that women are naturally nurturing and compassionate and not ambitious and not motivated, and men are naturally like striving and strong and courageous and like don't show their feelings. And, you know, this got polarized more than it was at all before, I think, to this real Mars and Venus model, which we have today, which is why anything that messes with that model is seen as so threatening, I guess. But, you know, that a lot of gender theorists will talk about the real loss that comes with that for everybody. So, you know, to be told like this set of things is not you can't have them, and to grow up, you know, as a kid, recognizing that and having to almost like eradicate those parts of yourself if you're to be seen as a proper girl or a proper boy and belong. You know, and we see that with research on young kids, is that girls are really learning at a young age that, oh, I should want to be pretty and I should want to, you know, have relationships, and boys thinking, oh well, I should want to be, you know, grow up and be successful, and also that they can only talk about anger really and not other feelings. It's you know, it's really polarized from quite a young age, and yeah, I think that part of the threat of the gender conversations is that they make everybody see, well, maybe we didn't need to have done that. Like you say, other traditions have an idea more of balance, or some have 5 genders or 3 genders, or just the whole idea of gender isn't so important to them. So our way of doing it is not the right way of doing it, it's just the one we've ended up with.
Well, and that's kind of one of my techniques when I try to reduce the blame and shame piece. So, you know, in that moment of awareness, we kind of pop out of our own model. We're suddenly getting a broader view of the landscape, and there may well be uncomfortable feelings about, oh my goodness, I didn't do it right. Or, oh my, you know, imagine, you know, as a healthcare provider, you know, somebody whose job it is, whose passion it is to help patients.
Yes.
You know, to suddenly be told, or to have the realization you did something that harmed, or you did something that wasn't skillful, or you actually were complicit in a system that actually fundamentally people are saying has traumatized them. And in the mental health services, this is some of the language. I know it sounds harsh, but talking to people using services, working a lot with peers and recovery model, they say that they've been traumatized by the system.
It's right, because you know the us and them is always going to damage people. You know, if when we set ourselves up as rescuers, you know, and kind of go in trying to fix people, we inevitably give them the idea they're broken, and often in those settings we give people a real double bind, because they've got to get better in order to prove to us that we've done a good job, but they can't get better, because if they get better, the us and them is broken, and suddenly they're us, and that's really threatening. So it's a nightmare scenario. You know?
It is a nightmare scenario. One of the ways I've been trying to work with that is when we go to this broader lens, is to look cross-culturally.
Yes.
Because there's something soothing, a little bit soothing to the mind, when you say, but look, over here, there's human beings just like you. There's some human beings over there, and, you know, maybe we minimize them because they're from indigenous cultures, or, you know, they're from another color of skin. I mean, there's all layers of conditioning there as well. But look, there's other people who think differently here. And I'm wondering if you might be able to think differently about that, if you could be in that cultural model. So for me, it's a model drawing on Tai Chi, Eastern philosophy. I think the mindfulness and some of the Buddhist language, not just Buddhism, but some of those concepts can be helpful there.
Well, that's right. It's so important, because, you know, at the moment we tend to look through our cultural lens of kind of white Western science, and rationalism is you know, the be all and end all that we've got to the truth. And actually, you know, that's another really problematic us and them. And the fact that we've kind of used that sense of superiority for hundreds of years to kind of justify colonizing and slaving as part of the problem that we're faced with now, is actually, it's generally not these cultures that have the best answers to this stuff at all. In fact, quite the opposite. These are the things that are, you know, basically destroying the planet and the basis of much human conflict. So yeah, we've really got to change the view there. And again, it's this complexity with difference. It's not about saying we're all the same. You know, it's not about saying, oh, we're colorblind, we're gender blind, it doesn't make any difference to me, you can call me any pronoun you like. You know, no, we've got to recognize that the systems that we have really marginalized and oppressed people, and that we have to look at that. And at the same time, we have to recognize that these kind of systems and structures are hurting us all, and we are kind of together in that. That is a shared experience, and sort of then it can focus us kind of to change the systems, rather than kind of keep with the kind of infighting around, you know, do trans people exist, or are white people really racist, or, you know, should we be trying to make things accessible for disabled people?
Yes, and I mean, you know, we're ranging around the topics, but I think, as you say, the nub of it is the same, which is, you know, what happens individually in that moment of like, and then what happens at the group level, what happens at the tribe level, let's say, whether that's psychologists or doctors or business leaders or whoever, and how not to make it lip service. Because that's the other thing that comes. I see that. Oh, well, we've got a woman on the board. You know, this Alexander Hampton report that came out. I think just more is coming out, you know. Well, we've already got one woman, you know, all the good women are taken. And it's like, I kind of couldn't believe that people actually said some of these phrases out loud for somebody to write that down.
Yeah. Oh yeah, exactly. And it's sort of like there's this also hierarchy of like, oh well, we're kind of being decent to the gays now, so trans people wait your turn, and non-binary people really wait till we've got the trans men and women on board, because you're just weird. You know, it's like there isn't a, you know, it's not like a queue where like each minority group gets added to it over time after being patiently waiting. It's about, you know, a system that's bad for everybody who's anywhere in that queue, and we need to shift the system. That's the thing.
Yeah. And I mean, going sort of to that, I mean, again, I'm going to draw on a few things from this book, because I found it really helpful. And I guess, you know, even for me as a mindfulness practitioner, as a therapist, you know, noticing just some of the stuff that comes up around the confusion of it. And I suppose as a mindfulness practitioner, I can see it more. I'm probably better able to language it. I'm less ashamed to talk about it.
Good,
because I know that airing it is the route to changing it. But you know, I remember a colleague was asking me, oh well, we've got these kids at a school, and the school is asking if they need to build a special toilet for one of the students that non-binary. They had a trustees meeting, board meeting at the school, and they were deciding, do they want to spend money on a science lab or a toilet, for the transgender student. And the story was really, really interesting, actually, because there were the usual things that come up with the use of toilets, which, again, they talk about in this book, and it's the main thing that everybody panics around.
Right. Trans people are so sick of talking about toilets, I can tell you. Like, especially as it's usually about the dangers that we pose to other people in toilets, when most of us have spent our lives being bullied in toilets. So
yes, and the reality and the data is actually speaking the opposite. And this is a key indicator, isn't it, of a problem that has an emotion. It's a problem that has an emotional origin and therefore needs an emotional solution. You're looking at the statistics and they tell you the story, but you can't hear the story.
Yes.
So then you know that you're in a habit, an emotionally driven, conditioned habit.
Right. Yeah.
Same as with the women on boards. The stats are clear. You put more women on boards, your company will make more money. It's very clear. It's very clear. And yet, they can't do it. It's really proving a struggle. It's really proving a struggle.
That's so interesting. And I think your point about shame is also really interesting, because I think you're right that when we get caught in that spiral of shame, then we maybe make a slight shift in the direction of better, but it's not enough. Like, we want people, I think any person in a marginalized group wants people to be real with them. Like, I would rather have this conversation, even if you get my pronoun wrong or we end up talking about toilets for 10 minutes, I'd rather have that than have the pretend conversation where it's like we don't need to have this conversation because we're all fine about this now, And it was making me think about this book White Fragility that's come out recently by Robin DiAngelo, and how it's like they talk about whites, or the author talks about white smiles, that white people will kind of go like to just doing this really uncomfortable smile around people of color all the time, which actually makes them feel almost as excluded as overt racism. And I guess there's a similar thing here, is that people get to that, I want to be an ally and I want to be a nice person place, but that's it's not about being nice. It's about genuine compassion, and those two are such different things. So genuine compassion requires being very real and really facing the difficult stuff within you and between you, whereas niceness is kind of a bit of a veneer that everybody can pick up on the fakeness, and it doesn't really come with systemic change. It doesn't really come with recognizing that other person as a human being who has exactly the same rights that you do.
And I mean, I think the way the story ended, and I may not have quite got the detail right, but it was something like there was this issue about which toilet to use. The male students got kind of very preoccupied by it and kind of went into a slightly aggressive piece around it.
Yeah.
And what happened was it ended up that the female students at the school kind of did some sort of sit-in where they were supporting the trans student, saying, no, we're all kind of on strike until this issue is resolved in a way that helps you and makes you feel comfortable, but you're with us. And when the person told me the story, I just almost had this image of some big hands, some arms, coming around, and even people there that were saying, I don't really understand, but actually as a human being, you're not being treated in a way that helps you to feel comfortable, allows you to thrive at this school, allows you to have basic needs met so that you can be in the classroom and get your studies done and be the awesome human being that you are.
And not go home with a urinary tract infection, which is what a lot of trans people do, because they just don't go to the toilet all day at school. But the thing is, architecture working on this now, there's really simple solutions around architecture and toilets that can make sure that there's toilets available for everyone. But obviously our existing institutions haven't been set up in that way. It's much like disability and accessibility. It's like, if we start designing things with multiple diverse bodies in mind, then just will be a non-issue. But at the moment there is that issue of like, well, do we put in a ramp or do we build a science lab, I guess. But I like that example, because I think the same rotten gender kind of messages, the same cultural baggage around gender is responsible, for that trans kid feeling isolated and unsafe, but also for the girls in that school feeling unsafe. We know about the levels of sexual harassment that still are in schools, girls having boys lift up their skirts and, kind of push them around in the corridors and sexually harass them. And also We know about boys not doing very well in schools. We know about the, you know, levels of mental health problems, you know, particularly addictions in young men, and, you know, the suicide rates. It's like, it's all part and parcel. So we've got to look at the whole thing as a system that needs changing, rather than focus on, oh, there's that special child that's asking for help and that's going to take something away from the others. And it's what you said, the bit you read out of the book, that kind of idea of trans people as a gift. It's like, actually, if that one person in the school means the whole school starts looking at gender norms, that's going to be better for everyone.
Yeah, fantastic. And, you know, that sense of then, you know, how to support people, you know, because they're sort of been thrust into this role that they probably didn't really want, but there is an opportunity there. And that for me is always the mindfulness piece, you know, inside the suffering and the dis-ease, there is often a nugget of something can be different.
Yeah.
How do we nurture that? Yeah.
It's like, people are so worried about trans people in toilets, and what they're really worried about is, you know, men attacking women. And, you know, the answer to that is not like deny trans people or deny trans people access to toilets. The answer to that is like, what's going on with this dynamic where men attack women so easily? And like, what are we teaching young men? What are we teaching young women? How might we do the whole thing differently? I think, you know, it becomes a red herring. It's a bit like with, you know, how immigrants get blamed, you know, when actually the problem is with those in the positions of power and the whole kind of structure in the country. It's you know, we blame the most marginalized often because we don't want to look at the wider situation.
And yes, there was a great thing in here. I mean, we'll move on from toilets, but there was something funny in this book which said, well, you know, if you're not sure what is a gender neutral toilet, you've probably got one in your house.
We're so fine with them. And do you know what? It's the same with the they pronouns. People are all like, oh, they pronouns, that's really difficult. And I'm like, well, but people use it all the time. They use it on Bake Off. You know, the bit in Bake Off where the judges don't know who's done what, they will completely happily use they pronouns. Oh, well, you know, they didn't cook this very well. You know, this one hasn't come out well. What were they thinking? You know, when we don't know the gender of someone, a singular someone, we use they pronouns. You know, the person's left their handbag here. I hope they come back for it. They must be missing it. You know, it's just the same. So when people struggle over it, it's kind of like, you know, I guess I mean, you know much more about the brain science part to me than me, but I guess I see it as, well, surely we already have a bit of our brain that's got used to they pronouns because we use it when we don't know someone's gender. Can we not quite easily just shift that to when somebody says they aren't a male or female gender as well, to encompass those people?
Well, and you'd think so, but this is the nature of the brain and the conditioning of the brain and the automaticity.
Right.
And because we're being conditioned so strongly all over the place, I mean, I think it is loosening in the younger generations. But for somebody my age, I'll speak about myself, you know, my brain has been shaped in that way.
Yeah.
So the prepotent response, you know, when I'm not paying attention, when I'm not sufficiently motivated, pay attention to do it, is going to be he and she.
Yeah.
And even when I was chatting to friends about doing this webinar, I was saying he and she, and then I was correcting.
You have to practice it. And also, as somebody who now has a lot of non-binary friends and also has been practicing, because I want to get it, you know, and when I started in this area, I was doing exactly the same thing, even though I'm they myself, right? So it's it's not that you leapfrog it if you're non-binary yourself as some kind of superpower. You know, it's just it's hard for us. But you really start to notice, you know, I will notice now sometimes I default to they, and then I have to correct myself when it's somebody who I actually do know prefers a he or she. So, do you know what I mean? People can practice on animals. So a lot of the time you meet an animal in the street and you don't know their gender.
Yeah.
So you can practice talking about them with they pronouns. I guess the really frustrating thing for non-binary people is when people aren't up for that practice and just only do it when they're in the presence of that person, because then they're inevitably going to get it wrong because they haven't rewired the brain sufficiently. So it's going to just keep coming out wrong. And again, under those circumstances, you know, all of us are pretty fine with someone saying sorry and moving on. Like, don't make a big deal out of it, because otherwise that ends up with us looking after you, which is kind of, you know, not the point. But like we're used to it. But it's just it's so nice when somebody corrects themselves or when somebody just gets it right, because you know they've put in the practice. Yeah.
And, you know, from a neuroscience point of view, there's an automatic habit that's about to be triggered I think the mindfulness does help in terms of the capacity to watch the words forming and then seeing them like about to come out of the mouth.
Yeah.
So there's this cognitive inhibition that's required. There's motor inhibition that's required.
Yeah.
We know this is the brain's braking system. It's fundamentally something that we train in a mindfulness practice, even when we go, oh, that's not breath. Let me get it back to the breath, or, oh, that's not me just receiving sounds. That's me thinking about the sound of an airplane and when I'm going to go on holiday. Hang on a minute.
Yeah.
The brain's braking system, right ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, one of my favorite areas.
I love that you have a favorite area of the brain.
Yes, well, they tend to change, but at the moment, this is the key one. And it's linked to self-control. It's linked to emotional regulation. Lots of individual differences, but I also believe in our modern world, it's really not getting a workout because we have zero delayed gratification. We just don't do that anymore.
Yeah.
And so that's why mindfulness is hard for people. They get stuck with it, they get bored with it, is because you have to delay gratification.
Yeah.
Even in a mindfulness training, guess what? You may not feel great after doing one session of mindfulness. It's about a cumulative effect that will improve your well-being overall. And some of those times you go around that loop and actually you don't feel better. You just go, oh my God, I'm really stressed. I'm really anxious. My heart's beating and my mind's racing, but I saw it.
Yeah, that's all you manage is to notice it, exactly, the first long period of time.
And this kind of is the model that I'm really working with sort of endlessly. It comes from a piece of research by Wendy Hassenkamp, studied mindfulness of the breath. But for me, this model is just, I'm using it all over the place. And, we focus on the breath. We start thinking about other stuff. Over here, Salience Network says, Tamara, you're not on the breath anymore. You're thinking about emails. What do you want to do? And this is interference. We measure it with Stroop experimentally, the prepotent response to read the name of the color rather than say the color. And I believe it's the same system here. There's a prepotent automatic response to say he or she, that we require the brain to say, that's not correct anymore.
Yeah, same
that's
thing.
Not correct anymore. And
oh my gosh, they pronouns is a mindfulness practice. That's what you're saying.
I am saying that. I am saying that. And then where you get to in that kind of corner here, I don't know if you can see that, which is where it says, oh, that's not breath. You need the awareness. You need the non-judgment, because guess what? You're going to get it wrong. You need to let go of what you want to do. And then suddenly the brain goes, but why? This is effortful. It's not what we do, and it's going to take effort, and I'm tired and I'm stressed and I've got a million things to do and I can't remember to say they instead of he or she. And when they're out of the room, I definitely can't be bothered. And when I'm chatting to colleagues, I'm just going to say her again. Yeah. And that's the piece where you then say, well, hang on a minute. Why is it important for me to be on the breath now? Why is it important for me to be, gentle and considerate and care about giving this individual the pronoun that they want? And then you're in the bigger picture, which is compassion and intentions. And this whole model sits for me inside another piece, which is a big bathtub of attention and compassion. Why the hell do we want to do this differently? Why?
The thing is, though, it's all about, I don't know, whether you want to sort of, the author I'm really into is Pema Chodron, and, she's talking about, like, the older you're getting, that you want to keep softening and opening up and taking off the armor rather than kind of hardening and closing down and putting on the armor. And at the end of the day, that's going to mean that you welcome death better, and also all the really hard stuff that comes the older we get, the loss and the pain. And so I think this is, again, it's just part of that bigger picture of that, on an individual level, that we want to open up rather than shut down, but also on a global level, surely, opening up more is going to be better than shutting down, actually being able to communicate and make contact kindly across difference. But as you say, it's we're so culturally conditioned to do the opposite, to not delay gratification, to quickly go into us and them and try and prove them wrong and us right. All of the kind of instincts are in the opposite direction.
And that's, for me, why Alan Wallace, we're touching now on kind of some of the more Buddhist teachers, but Alan Wallace talks about the voluntary evolution of consciousness. And for me, that's this you know, this right hand corner of the model, which is, you know, our brain and minds will respond in the conditioned ways, in the primitive ways, in the primordial ways, but we want to evolve from that. And you know, the social brain hypothesis, you know, talks about the evolution of the frontal cortex as a evolutionary advantage that allowed us to live in larger social groups. Conferred advantage for humans to live in these groups together, as it required us to develop an extra layer of working memory to think about others. For me, I now understand that we're giving this opportunity to deliberately widen again, this time not waiting for the genetics to change, because we haven't got time.
It's pretty urgent.
It's pretty urgent. And I guess where I see some of this work of, you know, minority groups is they're pushing us to do this, which is fantastic, because we won't even do it otherwise. I mean,
and it feels, you know, like there's a awareness of that, I think, around all of these marginalized groups of like, look, the thing we're asking you to do is going to be better for you as well and for the world. It's not like we just want you to be kinder to us for our benefit. It's like that the only way we can be really genuinely compassionate is when we can recognize all of those things in ourselves. We can be with our inner victims and our inner oppressors, you know. So we have to look outside at these systems we're caught up in and see the places where we oppress others and where we are oppressed, to really kind of feel that. And once we can feel like that, then we can resonate with that in others. We can actually have like that kind of deep empathy and connection, even when it's about things that aren't our thing. You know, we can make that leap, I guess, to kind of properly feel that feeling of what it's like to feel the shame, you know, of realizing you've got something wrong when you're the more privileged person, or feel, you know, the isolation and the kind of horrible, you know, not being mirrored by other people that you get when you're the minority or the marginalized person.
And that's really kind of seeing beyond, isn't it? And, you know, we talked about race and just even the gender, even the kind of normal gender of male and female, you know, let alone all the other kind of, you know, layers of that. And even just using the word normal there, sorry, that felt that felt
I got a good
right. They came out, I'm sorry.
It's fine. No, because this is it. No, we've again, another training we've had like throughout the last 100 years is that the real project of Western science has been to divide normal and abnormal, which bodies are normal, which are abnormal, which brains are normal and abnormal. You know what? It's the mental. You know, the whole project of kind of mental health and the DSM and everything has been to do that. But it's also been about, you know, it started really about race, about disability, about gender. So again, normal, abnormal is just our, you know, the backdrop, again, the one that we have to really question. But when it comes to non-binary, like you said, you know, your experience is that you identify as a woman, but you're more yang. And when they did a study on the general population and asked people, like, to what extent do you feel somewhat the other gender, or both genders, or neither gender, it was over a third of people said they felt that way. Like, in terms of experience, over a third of people would say, yeah, I don't fit neatly into the man box or the woman box. And in fact, when I do a training on this and we come up with all the cultural stereotypes of masculinity and femininity, like there's no one who says they fit completely on the masculine side or the feminine side, because that would be, you know, it's so extreme. So I think that's such an important piece about this. It's not about like this tiny minority of non-binary people asking for people to get their pronouns right. It's about like, gender just doesn't work like this. This whole two-box Mars and Venus thing is just flawed fundamentally. Like, we can't really divide people in that way.
And there's something there about being interested and being curious enough to ask people.
Yeah.
But for me, this is that more sort of bottom-up sociological research, social psychology research, rather than I've got some categories here and I want to see who fits into these categories that I've decided about because I'm an expert.
Right.
And instead it's kind of saying, well, what is this language? What are these words and terms and things that people are bringing?
Exactly, because if you ask people how many identify as male, female, or other, you'll get a pretty small percentage on the other, you know, maybe 0.5 to 1% these days. But if you do that other piece of research where you say, well, what's your experience? Suddenly it's over a third, you know, so like you say, that more open research. But interestingly, that was done by a bioscientist, that piece of research, who also found that the brains didn't map onto what we've generally thought of as male and female brains either. So even biologically, it's really hard to divide bodies and brains, you know, in a real binary way into male and female. Even on the level of chromosomes or genitals or hormones, we don't actually divide up as simply as people might think.
Yes, and I mean, again, I'm not a medical doctor. I can't necessarily speak to that literature, but in this book, you know, they were sort of suggesting that even at the level of biology and brain, it's not as cut and dried as people think. And there's many more kind of cases and instances where sort of gender might be determined or altered in some way, even at birth, and all these sorts of things. So it's even at the material level, it's not as cut and dried. And then, of course, you've got that layer of developmental conditioning. Then you've got the cultural conditioning, then you've got the training environments, education, or even the tribe that you join as a psychologist, as a doctor, as a lawyer, as a construction worker.
All those levels, we can find ourselves either buying into it and kind of, because we want to belong in those places, you know, we kind of adapt to it, or we can resist it. And so, you know, in the sense, you know, the kind of accusation of being snowflakes is often used against non-binary people, as if we're saying we're super fragile and we need all of this extra kind of attention. But actually, everyone is a snowflake in relation to their gender. Because if you think about those multiple layers of complexity at the cultural level, at the level of individual experience, at the level of our brains and bodies, and how it's, you know, it just wires up in a completely unique way for everybody. So I think the best way to think about gender is as snowflakes, that we're all, you know, while you look from a distance, they all look the same. As soon as you get really up close, they're going to be, you know, unique. Yeah. And yours is as complex as mine. Just because I'm non-binary and yours doesn't mean that mine is more complex than yours. Not at all.
Well, and also you, in a way, you've kind of got an advantage because you've been forced to think about it a bit more deeply than the sort of mainstream version.
Yeah, exactly.
We're kept in our blindness in a way by that system.
Yeah.
And you know, when I work in kind of in the mental health realm and talking about wounded healers and you know, kind of helping the therapists and the doctors that have their own stories of addictions or psychological problems, it's like there's almost like a double layer of stigma and deconditioning that's required, which does make it harder. And it's like, you know, talking to somebody that's like, well, sorry, you were forced to deal with your psychotic, your self-delusions because it just came out and you had to deal with it. But, you know, that's maybe in a way giving you a learning and growth opportunity that health professional that was trying to help you hasn't got to yet, and then still needs to go through the two layers, the tribe layer and then their own layer.
And so pretty much on all of these dimensions, it's really the people on the marginalized side who have the most to teach, because not only have they got there quicker, like you say, but also they have a much better understanding of the system and the structure, because they've been looking at it. They've been looking at whiteness, they've been looking at heterosexuality, they've been looking at you know, patriarchy and how it's hurt them. So they've got really important stuff to say, but we're still going in with this model of like it's the normals, you know, or the people in the privileged position who have the expertise and the knowledge. No, it's like, you know, again, it's this big flip that we have to do as a culture, which is deeply threatening. And it's no wonder we're in this time of backlash, because, you know, there's a real entrenched, like, let's keep hold of these old models, when, you know, we're talking about such a call for a complete upheaval of it all.
Well, and we see that in the mindfulness at the level of the individual, don't we? You know, you're just trying to get to the nub of the habit, and then, you know, the stressors come, and then the habit just gets entrenched again. And I think we're sort of fighting this with systems that are keeping minds and brains in threat anyways.
Yeah.
And then we're not only having to deal with minds and brains in threat, but we're also then giving them something threatening to deal with at the same time. So systemically, we're in uncertainty and threat, and then we're asking people to do deeply compassionate thinking and opening and dealing with guilt and shame and secondary gain, and you know, so it is a conundrum. But the compassion, I really believe, is the answer to this.
I think if we can learn to see that inner and outer as mutually reinforcing, if we can do that inner work, it helps us do the outer work, and vice versa. And again, I think that is about, you know, I do a lot of work, you know, you were talking about working with the shadow side of people. I think working with the inner critic is another really good one.
Yeah,
Working with different parts of ourselves, as we do in mindfulness, we notice the parts of ourselves that we really want to get rid of, and we find ways to welcome them in with compassion. And then we can do that more easily in the outer world. We can welcome in the people who seem really other and really different and really threatening, or we can welcome in the people who seem to be oppressing us, and actually find out, you know, how we're kind of interlinked in really complicated dynamics. And it's just big, heavy work, but I think that, you know, that those of us who can try and do it in both places, you know, that we will find that is more mutually reinforcing, and that compassionate way of doing it can be helpful, I hope.
Well, and so for me, this is kind of why I try to bring this models. You know, again, it's not for everybody, but it does somehow seem to provide something soothing, you know, to the brain. When you can kind of say, you know, as Paul Gilbert often says, amazing Paul Gilbert in all his talks, it's not your fault. Yeah, your brain is designed in a certain way, and it gets wired in a certain way around automaticity, and it's particularly wired in a strong way when emotions and tribes and other people are involved. This is just how it works. However, are we significantly invested and motivated in doing something different? If so, compassion is the route for ourselves initially, and the inner critic is that sort of salience network. How do I relate to myself when things are not as I want them to be? Am I judgy, blamey? Or can I just kind of go, interesting. Look at that. Oh dear, I wasn't expecting that. I thought I was a good therapist. I thought I was a good blah, blah. I was doing inclusion. Oh God. You know, yeah. And you will get that. So I think normalizing that is also a key thing that mindfulness does. You know, just normalizing is like, yes, this is the mess of the mind and brain, you know.
Yes. Yeah, I like it.
But the other piece for me then as well, and maybe we can sort of finish on this. I'm aware that we're almost coming up to time. I want to give you a chance to talk about some of your forthcoming projects.
Thank you.
But part of this book that I really liked was about, you know, what happens when we go more broadly to other cultures. And I guess some of the work, again, at the Mindfulness Center, we're sort of lifting the lid on the things we're not supposed to talk about, which is, let's talk about the biopsychosocial spiritual model, yes. You know, so including the spirituality aspect. The transpersonal lens is beyond brain, beyond brain, into mind, beyond mind even. And what I loved here was they were talking about indigenous traditions, where they recognized and valued what they referred to as two spirit people, a sacred and spiritual role incorporating male and female elements. And they talked about Hawaiian and traditions from Tahiti. And this line here, which I loved, what is common is that in many societies, a tie has been made between breaking gender boundaries and spirituality. Non-binary people can be seen as more in tune with the spiritual world as performers of valued rituals and keepers of special knowledge. And I don't know if kind of non-binary and trans people are necessarily doing rituals or keeping special knowledge, but it seems to me that there is a role, there is something happening there that's about helping us as a community of human beings to evolve into a more enlightened view of some sort.
And again, this sort of Western way of seeing things as these identity categories, whereas, you know, in various cultures around the world, gender, sexuality, spirituality haven't been like teased apart in this way, or, you know, there's quite a violence to the way they have been kind of cracked apart, actually. And often when I do a training on gender, we do end up talking about the spiritual dimension, actually. And I think that going down these paths to understanding one's gender and one's sexuality better often leads you into those places. So I think, you know, again, it's about looking really critically at our own culture and what it's done, you know, to other cultures. I mean, literally, you know, white British people tried to eradicate two-spirit people when they colonized those countries. So, you know, we seem to have a historical problem with anyone doing gender differently. But, you know, it's about, thinking that actually, can we learn? And I guess, you know, mindfulness is in a very interesting position on this one, because mindfulness movement has been like, can we learn from Eastern philosophy? and it has real problems with this. You know, when I went to a big mindfulness conference in this country, it was predominantly white men talking to an audience of predominantly white women, and no one really seeing a problem with that.
Yes, well, I did raise that at one of those meetings where I said, how are we going to make sure we don't make the same mistakes that we have made with the mental health services, which is that they're not engaging people from Black and minority ethnic groups. They're not engaging young people and people from marginalized communities. They're not serving up something that speaks to them. You know, where is this here?
Exactly. Even the language of it. I remember, you know, a white guy doctor standing up and saying, oh, well, you know, we notice it's mostly white people who come to our clinic. You know, we're thinking about going into these, you know, how do we get more people from these communities? And I'm like, this is so patronizing. You know, you're talking about communities that have rich spiritual and faith traditions already, and you're worried about why they're not engaging with your somewhat watered down version of Buddhism. Like, you know, that is another way of seeing that. And like, you know, it's got to be a complex dialogue, but it can't be a dialogue that comes from the position of here we are with this superior thing that we've got, this mindfulness thing that now we've put a whole load of science on it. You know, we're kind of like, it's the best and we need to sell it to everybody and make quite a lot of money from it often. You know, it's we need to see that within patriarchy, within colonialism, within capitalism. We need to not make the same mistakes again, and I think that we kind of are making the same mistakes again, so we have to be super careful. Well,
listen, just take some time to just, you know, share a little bit about some of your upcoming things. I mean, it feels like we could have a whole another conversation, and I think maybe we will, because you do also so many other interesting things, but just give the viewers a bit of highlights of what's coming up for you, I guess, in the next 6 months or year. We'll put all the links and everything under the video so people can access and find your work. But yeah, give us a sense of what's coming up.
Yeah, well, I mean, definitely all my books are listed on my website, rewritingtherules.com, so you can see that. And I also have this ongoing podcast with a sex and relationship educator, Justin Hancock, called Meg, John and Justin. So if you prefer to listen rather than read stuff, that's it's quite a fun podcast. But yeah, if people are interested in my work on mindfulness, that's mostly in a book called Mindful Therapy. So that's written for practitioners, and it's very much how we can take this sort of more cultural approach to mindfulness. So social mindfulness is something that Stephen Stanley and I and a bunch of other people have been very engaged with. Like, what does a socially engaged mindfulness look like? And there's a good bit of that in that book. But if people are interested in gender, I've written a self-help book called How to Understand Your Gender with Alexi and Taffy. So that's a really nice starting point. And again, it's for everyone, not just for trans and non-binary people. And this year I've got a book coming out called Gender, A Graphic Guide. And it's a comic-like introduction to both like the history of gender and the biopsychosocial aspects of gender, all the things we've been talking about, really. And I've also got a book coming out called Life Isn't Binary with Alexi and Taffy. So it's taking this whole idea of non-binary and applying it way beyond sexuality and gender to other things like emotions and how we can think in non-binary ways. So it very much relates to what we've been talking about. And I love this idea of they pronouns as a mindful practice.
Yes, I've been practicing myself and training that right ventrolateral prefrontal cortex.
And it's a brilliant way to convince, like, you know, people to do it. It's like, oh well, you'll be doing mindfulness practice if you work on this.
Well, fantastic. Maybe we can put a little blog about that on the Mindfulness Center webpage. That would be great. And you know, non-binary, non-dual. You know, if we want to go there, we can too.
What surprises me about both Buddhism and mindfulness is like how they've remained so kind of dualistic about gender when the thinking about so many other things is non-dualistic. It's like, I find that really curious.
And you mentioned as well, and I saw a few interesting things on your blogs, you know, about this kind of question of erotica and reclaiming erotica. And I think there is, you know, the sexual shadow stuff and that stuff coming up.
Yeah. There can be that real tendency in Buddhism and in mindfulness to be like, let's not go there with kind of actual erotic experience and with sex. And again, the Me Too movement has shown us how very dangerous it is not to look at that stuff. That's where abuse of power starts happening. So yeah, I've got a big one really about how tuning into the erotic in ourselves can really help us do this kind of work in terms of self-compassion and also in terms of, you know, facing our demons or doing the shadow work that you talk about.
Well, I definitely want to have another conversation about that. That's the whole point of the Mindfulness Center of Excellence, people, is that we go to the topics. And other people are like just tiptoeing or looking away. And we may not always get it right, but it's absolutely fully in the service of learning from mistakes, having conversations, normalizing, destigmatizing, and also just having awesome individuals, however they want to identify themselves, you know, bringing their passion, bringing their work, bringing their awesomeness to the table and sharing it with as many people as possible. So if you like this video and it touched you in some way, like, open a conversation with somebody near to you, dear to you, or just a random person that you meet at the bus stop. Share something about this topic to somebody, because let's get it out in the open. We don't need to be afraid. We don't need to be tiptoeing around. We just need to be real. And, you know, hand on heart is often a good way to just check in with, you know, well, it feels a bit uncomfortable, but I'm going to keep going. Or actually, no, this feels like it's really real and I don't need all these layers around me. And what can we really do together? So I will end there. I'm going to stop the recording. So saying goodbye to those of you that have joined, and keep a lookout on the Mindfulness Center of Excellence webpage for future webinars. I've got a few guests lined up for the rest of this year, a little bit top secret at the moment, but keep in touch, and you can sign up to the mailing list as well. And have a great day wherever you are. Stopping now.